The Hürtgen Forest, Germany, November 12, 1944. A scream cuts through the fog. It's not a scream of combat, not the sharp cry of a man hit by bullets. It's different, desperate, prolonged. The sound of someone who knows they're about to die and can do nothing to stop it. An American soldier lies wounded in the middle of a minefield called Wild Sow, Wild Boar, in German. He can't move. Every inch around him is seeded with death. One wrong movement, one shift of weight, and the mines will tear him apart. His cries echo across no man's land. American troops hear him but can't reach him. The minefield is too dense, too deadly. They've already lost men trying. Now they can only listen as their comrade screams for help that won't come. On the German side, soldiers hear it too. Most turn away. This is war men die. That's the reality of the Hürtgen Forest. The bloodiest battle most Americans have never heard of. But one man doesn't turn away. Lieutenant Friedrich Lengfeld, 23 years old, commander of the 2nd Company, 275th Infantry Division, Wehrmacht. He's heard screams before. He's seen men die in horrific ways. He's fought on the Eastern Front. He knows what war costs. But something about this scream is different. Maybe it's because the American has been crying out for hours. Maybe it's because Lengfeld can hear the desperation, the youth in that voice. Maybe it's simply because he's still human in a place designed to strip humanity away. Lengfeld makes a decision that will cost him his life. He turns to his men and says 2 words. Follow me. This is the story of what happened next and why, 50 years later, American veterans would build a monument to honor the German officer who tried to save their enemy. Friedrich Lengfeld was born on September 29, 1921, in Germeringen, Bavaria. He grew up in southern Germany during the chaotic years of the Weimar Republic's collapse and the Nazi Party's rise to power. Unlike many Wehrmacht officers whose stories have been heavily documented, Lengfeld remains somewhat enigmatic. We don't have extensive records of his childhood, his family life, or his early motivations. What we do know is that he was young, barely out of his teens when World War II began. He joined the Wehrmacht and served on the Eastern Front, one of the most brutal theatres of the war. The Eastern Front wasn't just combat, it was annihilation warfare. Soldiers who served there witnessed horrors that would haunt them forever. Lengfeld survived it. He was promoted to lieutenant and given command of the 2nd Company, 275th Infantry Division. By November 1944, Lengfeld found himself in the Hürtgen Forest, defending German territory against the American advance. He was 23 years old. He'd been at war for 5 years. He'd seen friends die. He'd given orders that sent men to their deaths. He'd become hardened in ways no 23-year-old should be. But he hadn't become indifferent. Those who served with Lengfeld described him as a leader who cared about his men. His motto, repeated often to his soldiers, was simple: follow me. Not go there, not attack that position, but follow me. He led from the front. He didn't ask his men to do anything he wouldn't do himself. On November 12, 1944, that philosophy would be tested in the most final way possible. To understand what happened, you need to understand where it happened. The Battle of the Hürtgen Forest lasted from September 1944 to February 1945. It was one of the longest battles fought by the US Army in World War II, and one of the deadliest. American forces suffered approximately 33,000 casualties. German casualties were similarly devastating. The forest itself was a nightmare. Dense evergreen trees blocked sunlight, creating permanent twilight. The canopy was so thick that artillery shells exploded in the treetops, sending deadly wooden splinters down like shrapnel. Soldiers called them tree bursts. Men were killed by flying wood as often as by bullets. The terrain was broken, hilly, muddy. Roads were few. Visibility was measured in meters, not miles. Tanks bogged down in the mud. Communications were nearly impossible. Units got lost in the fog and forest, stumbling into enemy positions or their own minefields. And there were mines everywhere. The Germans had been preparing these defences for months. They'd seeded the forest with thousands of anti-personnel and anti-tank mines. Paths were mined. Clearings were mined. Trails that looked safe were death traps. Soldiers stepped on mines and disappeared in red mist. Others triggered mines and lost legs, screaming until medics could reach them. If medics could reach them. One of these minefields was called Wilde Sau, Wild Boar. It sat between American and German lines near the town of Hürtgen. It was a killing ground. Both sides knew it. Both sides avoided it. Until November 12th, 1944. We don't know his name. That's the tragedy and the mystery of this story. The American soldier who triggered this entire event remains anonymous. Military records from the Hürtgen Forest are incomplete. Units were decimated. Paperwork was lost. Entire companies ceased to exist in the chaos. What we know is this. During fighting near the Wilde Sau minefield, an American soldier became trapped. Either he was wounded during combat and fell into the minefield, or he was attempting to cross it and stepped on a mine. The explosion didn't kill him outright. It wounded him badly enough that he couldn't move. Now he was lying in the middle of a minefield, bleeding, possibly with shattered legs, knowing that any movement might set off another mine. He couldn't crawl forward. He couldn't crawl back. He was paralyzed by pain and terror, so he screamed. He screamed for his buddies. He screamed for medics. He screamed for anyone who could help him. His voice carried across the battlefield. Americans heard him. Germans heard him. Everyone heard him, and nobody could reach him. American soldiers tried. According to accounts, several men attempted to navigate the minefield to reach their comrade. At least one was killed by mines. Others were driven back by German fire. The Americans were still enemies, after all, and the Germans couldn't allow a rescue party to establish a position in no man's land. So the screaming continued. Hours passed. The American soldiers' cries grew weaker, but didn't stop. Imagine being close enough to hear your friend dying and being unable to help. Imagine being the soldier in that minefield, hearing friendly voices but watching no one come. It was unbearable. For everyone. On the German side, Lieutenant Friedrich Lengfeld listened to the screams. His position was near the minefield. He could hear every cry. He knew what was happening. He knew the American was dying slowly, painfully, alone. Lengfeld gathered several of his men. Among them was a soldier named Hubert, who would later provide testimony about what happened next. Lengfeld explained what he intended to do: cross the minefield, reach the wounded American, and bring him back to German lines for medical treatment. His men must have thought he was insane. This wasn't their responsibility. The American was the enemy. He'd been trying to kill them hours earlier. They were under no obligation, military or moral, to risk their lives for him. This was war. People died. That was the reality, but Lengfeld saw it differently. The American wasn't fighting anymore. He was just suffering. And Lengfeld had the power to end that suffering, or at least try. He turned to his men and said the words they'd heard before. "Follow me." Several soldiers volunteered to go with him. They gathered medical supplies and prepared to enter the Wilde Sau minefield. They knew the odds. They knew what they were risking. But their commander was going, and they would follow. According to Hubert, there was no grand speech, no philosophical debate. Lengfeld simply said they were going to help the American because it was the right thing to do. In the middle of the Hürtgen Forest, in the middle of the war, surrounded by death, Friedrich Lengfeld decided that humanity mattered more than survival. They entered the minefield. Moving through a minefield is psychological torture. Every step might be your last. You watch the ground, looking for disturbances, wires, anything that might indicate a mine. You move slowly, deliberately, testing each step before committing your weight. Lengfeld led. His men followed in his footsteps, literally walking where he walked, trusting his judgment, praying he wouldn't step wrong. The American soldier saw them coming. He must have thought he was hallucinating, enemy soldiers approaching to help him. It was impossible, but they kept coming, carefully navigating the deadly ground. Lengfeld reached the wounded American. Accounts vary on what happened next. War stories often do. Some versions say Lengfeld and his men successfully reached the soldier and were preparing to carry him back. Others suggest they were still approaching when disaster struck. What's certain is that Friedrich Lengfeld stepped on a mine. The explosion was instantaneous. Lengfeld was thrown into the air, shrapnel tore through his body. He fell back to the ground, grievously wounded. Hubert and the other German soldiers rushed to their commander. They dragged him from the minefield, desperate to save him. American soldiers, watching from their lines, held their fire. Something unspoken passed between the two sides in that moment, an acknowledgement that what they were witnessing transcended the battle. The Germans carried Lengfeld back to their lines. He was still alive, still conscious. But the wounds were catastrophic. Medics did what they could, but in the Hürtgen Forest in 1944, with limited medical supplies and no way to evacuate him quickly, there was little hope. Friedrich Lengfeld died later that day, November 12, 1944. He was 23 years old. He'd been attempting to save an enemy soldier's life. Here's where the story becomes frustrating. We don't know what happened to the American soldier. Some accounts suggest he died in the minefield before Lengfeld reached him, his wounds too severe, his time simply running out. Other versions claim German soldiers eventually retrieved him after Lengfeld's death, brought him to their lines, and treated his wounds before sending him to a POW camp. Military records don't provide a clear answer. The chaos of the Hürtgen Forest made documentation difficult. Units lost track of their own soldiers, let alone enemy casualties. The American could have died, could have survived, could have been anyone. This ambiguity is heartbreaking. If he survived, he never knew, or never came forward to acknowledge, that a German officer died trying to save him. If he died, Friedrich Lengfeld's sacrifice was futile in the immediate sense, though not in its larger meaning. We'll likely never know. The American soldier remains anonymous, a ghost in a story about humanity in the midst of horror. Friedrich Lengfeld was buried in the German military cemetery at Hürtgen. His death was recorded in Wehrmacht files. His family was notified. For them, he was another casualty of a war that was clearly lost by November 1944. One more young man who wouldn't come home. Among his fellow soldiers, however, Lengfeld's death was remembered differently. Hubert, who witnessed everything, carried the story for decades. Other members of the Second Company who'd known Lengfeld spoke of what he'd done. The story spread, quietly, in the way soldiers' stories do, through the ranks of men who'd served in the Hürtgen Forest. On the American side, the incident was also remembered, though perhaps less clearly. American soldiers who'd watched German troops enter the minefield, who'd held their fire as they carried their wounded commander back, knew something extraordinary had happened. But in the overwhelming chaos and trauma of the Hürtgen Forest, individual acts of heroism, even by enemies, could be forgotten amid the larger horror. The battle raged on. The forest continued killing. The war ground forward. Friedrich Lengfeld's grave was just one among thousands. For 50 years, that's where the story might have ended. A footnote. A minor incident, one death among millions, but stories of genuine humanity have a way of surviving. In the 1990s, something remarkable happened. American veterans of the Hürtgen Forest battle began returning to Germany. Many were elderly now, in their 70s, making final pilgrimages to the place where they'd fought as young men. They visited the military cemeteries. They walked the forest trails, now peaceful and quiet. They tried to make sense of what they'd experienced 50 years earlier, the friends they'd lost, the horrors they'd witnessed, the decades of nightmares that followed. During these visits, some American veterans heard the story of Friedrich Lengfeld. Perhaps they heard it from German locals. Perhaps they met Hubert or other survivors of the 275th Infantry Division who'd kept the story alive. Perhaps they'd been there themselves that day in November 1944 and had never forgotten the German officer who entered the minefield. However they learned it, the Americans were profoundly moved. Here was a German officer, a Wehrmacht lieutenant, an enemy soldier who had died trying to save an American. Not for propaganda, not for strategic advantage, not because he was ordered to, but because he heard a man screaming and decided to help. The American veterans began an effort to honour Friedrich Lengfeld. They researched his story, verified the details with German records and survivor testimony, and raised funds. They wanted to do something unprecedented, build a monument to an enemy soldier on a battlefield where that enemy had been trying to kill them. In 1994, exactly 50 years after Lengfeld's death, American veterans of the Hürtgen Forest battle erected a memorial stone near the spot where he died. The monument stands in the forest bearing an inscription in both English and German. It reads, "No man hath greater love than he who layeth down his life for his enemy." The dedication ceremony brought together American veterans, German veterans, Lengfeld's surviving family members, and local German officials. Former enemies stood together, elderly men now, to honour a moment of humanity that had occurred during their war photographs from the ceremony show old soldiers with tears streaming down their faces. American veterans saluting a German officer's memorial, German veterans embracing Americans who'd fought against them. It was reconciliation in its purest form, not forgetting the war, but choosing to remember its rare moments of grace alongside its horror. Friedrich Lengfeld's story challenges every simple narrative about World War II. We're used to thinking of the war in absolutes: Allies good, Axis evil, Americans liberators, Germans aggressors. There's truth to these characterizations. The Nazi regime was monstrous. The Holocaust was genocide. The German war of aggression caused unprecedented suffering. But individual soldiers are not the same as the regimes they serve. Friedrich Lengfeld wore a Wehrmacht uniform. He fought for Germany. He took orders from a murderous dictatorship. None of that changes. Yet when he heard an enemy soldier screaming, he walked into a minefield to help him. This creates moral complexity that's uncomfortable but necessary. Lengfeld wasn't a Nazi hero. There's no such thing. He wasn't fighting for a just cause, but in one moment he chose humanity over ideology, compassion over duty, mercy over survival. That choice killed him. And 50 years later, the men he'd been trying to kill honoured him for it. The American veterans who built Lengfeld's memorial understood something profound. War creates enemies, but humanity can transcend enmity. Lengfeld had been their enemy. He'd been shooting at them. If he'd survived the war, they might have met as adversaries in battle again. But when he died trying to save one of them, he became something else. Not a friend, the gap was too wide for that, but not an enemy either. Something more complicated. A reminder that even in war's worst moments, individuals can choose to be more than soldiers. If you visit the Hürtgen Forest today, it's peaceful. The trees have grown back. The scars have healed. Tourists hike the trails. The forest seems ordinary, almost gentle. But if you know where to look, the war is still there. Rusted metal, fragments of fortifications, and cemeteries. So many cemeteries. German graves, American graves, markers for the missing. The forest is full of young men who never went home. Friedrich Lengfeld's memorial stands in the forest, maintained by both German and American veteran organizations. Fresh flowers are often placed there, sometimes by visitors who never knew him, never fought in the war, but who've heard his story and been moved by it. The inscription remains clear: "No man hath greater love than he who layeth down his life for his enemy." It's adapted from John 15:13. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. But the memorial changes the word not friends, enemy. Because that's what Friedrich Lengfeld did. He didn't die for his comrades, though he would have. He died for someone trying to kill him hours earlier. He died for a stranger whose name he didn't know, whose language he didn't speak, whose country he was fighting against. That's not normal wartime heroism. That's something rarer and more difficult to categorize. Friedrich Lengfeld's story raises questions that haunt anyone who studies it. What was he thinking as he entered that minefield? Did he believe he could save the American and survive? Was he motivated by Christian compassion, military honor, simple human decency, or something else? Did he think about his family? Did he hesitate? We don't know. We'll never know. Lengfeld didn't survive to explain himself, and the historical record is sparse. We have Hubert testimony, military records, and the memorial. Everything else is interpretation. Some people see Lengfeld as proof that not all German soldiers were Nazis, that good men were trapped in an evil system. Others argue that his service in the Wehrmacht, regardless of this single act, makes him complicit in Nazi crimes. Still others view him as simply human, flawed, complex, capable of both participation in a horrific war and a moment of transcendent compassion. All these interpretations have some validity. Lengfeld was all these things: soldier, human being, participant in an unjust war, individual capable of extraordinary mercy. He doesn't fit into a simple category. Perhaps that's the point. The American soldier's anonymity makes the story even more haunting. We can't ask him what he felt when he saw German soldiers approaching. We can't know if he survived, if he ever learned what Lengfeld did, if he carried guilt or gratitude. He's a void at the centre of the story, the person for whom everything happened, whose suffering started the chain of events, and who remains unknown. History is full of these gaps. War documents battles but loses individuals. Friedrich Lengfeld has become symbolic of something larger than himself. His story appears in books about the Hürtgen Forest, in documentaries about World War II, in discussions about military ethics and human compassion. He's taught in military academies as an example of leadership, a commander who lived his motto of "follow me" to its final, fatal conclusion. He's cited in discussions about the laws of war and the treatment of wounded enemies. He's referenced in debates about moral responsibility within unjust systems. But perhaps Lengfeld's most important legacy is simpler. He reminds us that enemies are human. In war, we dehumanize opponents. We have to, psychologically, to be able to kill them. They become the enemy, abstract and threatening. We stop seeing them as individuals with families, fears, and capacity for compassion. Lengfeld broke through that dehumanization. He heard an enemy soldier screaming and heard a human being in agony. He responded not as a German to an American, not as Wehrmacht to US Army, but as one person to another. That response killed him, but it also immortalized him, not as a hero of Germany or an enemy of America, but as an example of what humans can choose to be even in the darkest circumstances. The American veterans who built his memorial understood this. They weren't honoring a German soldier. They were honoring a choice, the choice to value human life over ideology, compassion over enmity, mercy over survival. That choice is available to everyone, in every conflict. We don't always take it. We find reasons not to. Practical reasons, strategic reasons, ideological reasons. Lengfeld had all those reasons too. He took the risk anyway. That's the real legacy of the German officer who died trying to save an American enemy. Not the death, but the choice that led to it. Not the tragedy, but the humanity that caused the tragedy. In the Hürtgen Forest, in November 1944, surrounded by death and horror and endless war, Friedrich Lengfeld heard a scream and decided that human suffering mattered more than politics, nationality, or survival. He was right, and we remember him because deep down we know he was right. The scream has faded. The war has ended. The forest has healed, but the choice remains. Friedrich Lengfeld's choice. The choice to answer when someone screams. The choice to help even when it costs everything. The choice to see humanity in your enemy. That choice is still available, every day, to everyone. Friedrich Lengfeld walked into a minefield to make that choice. What will we risk to make it?